And the BBC's handling of the Gaza conflict continues to spark fury from critics, not least by continually describing the death cult Hamas as, quote, a prescribed terror organisation by the UK government and others. What a mouthful.
Let's start with the Islamist militant group that carried out this attack. Who are Hamas?
But more than 1,000 people have now been killed in Israel and Gaza after a massive attack by Hamas militants that began at dawn. Gaza is governed by Hamas, which is designated as a terrorist organisation by many governments, including the UK.
Hamas wears a lot of hats, doesn't it? It is a militant group, but it's also a political party and an Islamist movement.
That wordy description across all the BBC's radio and TV bulletins is the corporation's new party line after initially calling Hamas militants. They later dropped the offensive term after outrage from viewers. It followed other BBC gaffes, including fake news reports that Israel bombed a Gaza hospital, killing 500 people, later shrugged off as a mistake by a top BBC news exec who, let's be honest, is still going to be in a six-figure salary job. Friend of the show, Laura Dodsworth, was left riled again this weekend by the BBC's continued Hamas tiptoeing, tweeting the BBC's mealy-mouthed descriptions are a national embarrassment and a danger. Just call Hamas terrorists. Of course, she's absolutely right. But what do you think? Has the BBC lost the trust of the British people over its Israel reporting? Let me know your thoughts. Mark at gbnews.com or at gbnews on Twitter, and do vote in the poll. But to debate this now, I'm delighted to welcome Reform Party spokesman and former owner of Southampton FC, Rupert Lowe, and the ex-head of religious and ethical programming at the BBC, Arkil Ahmed. Arkil, very good to have you on the show. Nice to meet you for the first time. Do you think the BBC has lost the confidence of the British public?
No, they haven't. Obviously, I've got to be very honest, Mark. I'm speaking here in a personal capacity. I don't represent anybody, obviously, in this instance. Look, the fact of the matter is, I know you want to make this about the BBC, but obviously other broadcasters are also using the similar term. They're not referring to them as terrorists. There will be people on the programmes calling them terrorists, but the BBC reporters will be using the word prescribed terror organisation, etc., which is what other organisations are also doing as well. It's not something they are terrorists, in my opinion, right? I'm not saying I'm not a fan of Hamas. I actually made the film with Hamas when they were the government 2006. So I've seen it. I know what Hamas are like. I don't want to be kind of like portrayed here as some kind of apologist, but there is a way that people behave in terms of journalism, and particularly when you've got people on the ground that you yourself don't prescribe, say something, but other people do. And I think that's what they're doing, as are other broadcasters as well.
OK, Rupert, do you accept that defence of the BBC?
Completely not, Mark. I think the BBC is very much losing the British public. I've written many articles about the BBC, Time to Axe Auntie. She was supposed to be informing, educating and entertaining with complete impartiality. That was her charter. A very different era. Mr. Reith, basically a very upstanding man. I think at that time probably there was a role for the BBC, but I think now it's become malign, partisan. It's very, very, very not impartial. So it's a shocking organisation, and it's dripping poison and division into the blood of Britain every day. So this recent Hamas issue, I'm afraid I do call them a terrorist organisation, because that's what Hamas are. It's shameful that the BBC doesn't call them that. For anybody who can go and inflict a pogrom, genocide, whatever you want to call it, on 1,400 innocent people, to cut their heads off, to murder them, to then poke their eyes, to take hostages. Quite frankly, Mark, I think Israel, which is a civilized country, we should be protecting the Jewish people. They're part of our world. And until Hamas releases the hostages, I think Israel, as a civilized country, which has basically seen Gaza increasing its population, increasing its wealth. You've got Hamas hiding behind the Palestinian people. I think they've got every right to protect themselves in whatever way is necessary. And if the BBC keeps poisoning our public, the public can see it. They accused them immediately of blowing up a hospital, which has now proved to be actually one of the Hamas rockets. Jeremy Bowen is using this person who is a well-known, I think he's called Saleh al-Jafarawi, who's a well-known Hamas propagandist. And quite apart from the BBC's history of employing a string of extremely bad people, from Jimmy Savile to Rolf Harris to, I've got a list of them here, Martin Bashir, Mark Page. They've got a history of basically getting it very badly wrong. And I think now it's time for the BBC to be defunded. I think it has to be done in a responsible way. It's a monopoly. Britain has not enjoyed monopolies or liked them really since the Civil War. And they, in the end, become malign, and the BBC has become malign. So I think it needs to be defunded in a responsible way. And those people who want to pay a fee to subscribe to the BBC should be able to do that. For me, Mark, if that march goes ahead, on Sunday, on Remembrance Sunday, then I think the very patient, decent British people have every right to start stirring. And I think they have a duty to do that if our police don't actually uphold the law, which they're not doing at the moment.
Arkil, you're shaking your head.
No, I just look. There's that whole thing. This is not a story about the BBC. This is a story about what's going on in Gaza right now, and some of the things that and the
BBC's reporting, Arkil.
Well, that's it, and every other broadcaster is reporting.
Well, first of all, the BBC very arrogantly stood by using the term militants for a couple of weeks before they changed tack. That demonstrates that they misjudged this one. Plus, they erroneously said that a hospital in Gaza had been blown up by Israel without knowing the facts. This is supposed to be the most trusted news outlet in the world. Many people might have died as a result of the propaganda off the back of that story.
Virtually everybody covered that same story. Well, I know you want to make this about the BBC, but everybody covered that.
But not everyone pointed the finger at Israel, Arkil.
In this country, all the major news organisations have the same similar story. And actually, at this moment in time, there are so many different interpretations of that. I think I know which one it is. I think it's very similar to the one that you're describing. This is probably remnants of a rocket that was coming from Hamas. But the fact of the matter is there are lots of different interpretations. And actually, that's one of the things that you often have in the fog of war, that you have to be very clear about how you report. It's very difficult when you've got boots on the ground, actually. And particularly right now, when we're living in a particular period where, once again, there's been a communications blackout. So we do need to have that kind of reporting. Not everybody's going to get it right all the time. And in fact, it's really important that sometimes you can actually just step back a little bit and use words like alleged. And also, we don't know exactly what has happened in every single instance. In some of them that we do, but in every single instance, we don't know. And having had to make decisions myself sometimes, you don't know what the truth's going to be. I've been in situations where people have been saying one thing, you get there on the ground, and it's the complete opposite of what you've been told.
You've briefly, Arkil, I guess you would disagree with the premise that the BBC has lost the confidence of the British public, but it's certainly lost the confidence of many British Jews. What would you say to them, Arkil?
I agree with you. I think it's nuanced. I think lots of people have lost confidence with the BBC and have lost confidence with broadcasting full stop. If you look at every single report into broadcasting around the world, there are people who are losing confidence of it. That's why GBNews exists, for the people who don't want it from the BBC or Channel 4 News. I'm all for that. I actually say that. I don't think they're losing lots of people over this. They're losing people all the time because that's what happens. And with regards to what you said about my friends who are Jewish as well, I completely understand why people might be upset on either side. The problem is lots of people, whether you are pro-Palestinian or you're outrageously hurt by what happened on October the 7th, understand there are people who find this really passionate and it's very difficult to kind of like distance yourself from the other side. And I fully accept that if people are really upset, and a lot of my friends who are Jewish who are really upset, and I know that they've said that to me as well, I can understand that. I really do understand that.
Arkil, great to meet you for the first time. Look forward to our next on-air encounter. Arkil Ahmed is the former head of religious and ethical programming at the BBC. He's a top professor as well. He knows his onions. Plus, the brilliant Rupert Lowe, former Southampton FC CEO and owner and Reform Party spokesman. Thank you, chaps. Your thoughts, mark at gbnews.com. Now, the BBC have said we always take our use of language very seriously. Anyone watching or listening to our coverage will hear the word terrorist used many times. We attribute it to those who are using it, for example, the UK government. This is an approach that has been used for decades and is in line with that of other broadcasters. So, following their gaffe-laden Israel coverage, has the Beeb lost the trust of the British people? Ed says, Mark, they've been losing the public trust for a while now, but their coverage of Hamas has been really awful. Sheila says, I never trusted the BBC anyway, not after Jimmy Savile and Rolf Harris. Matt says both sides in the Israel-Gaza war are complaining about the BBC's coverage, so they're definitively proving that balance is their remit. Well, your verdict is in. 92% agree that the Beeb has lost the trust of the British people. 8% say they have not.